today I'm going to present a project that is very much in its early stages, so I would love any thought or comment you may have on the project itself, as well as on a general subject matter. The tentative title of this project is The Intricacies of Tax of Globalization, and essentially what I want to do is really focus on these two areas, on globalization and on taxation, especially tax policy, and really look how each area influences and shapes one another, and try to map this relationship at least to some extent. So the starting point of this project is really the fact that taxation has been criticized for many years for being technical in nature and lacking a broad contextual perspective. With the increased forces of globalization, especially since the mid-80s, we've seen a resurgence of comparative legal scholarship. And with it, over the past decade or so, we've also seen comparative tax scholarship or comparative tax legal scholarship really starting to shape into a subdiscipline on its own term. Methodologically, we're generally not talking about any unique or strategic approach that is any different from any comparative legal analysis. But at the same time, what we will generally see is a functional problem-solving focus. That is, what we will see is basically the focus of legal scholars or tax scholars or different challenges within the tax system, and then addressing how these challenges are being resolved or addressed in different countries. In fact, one may say that tax law may be best understood by exploring the different ways in which it played out in the global sphere. So, global perspective can be very instrumental, not only in order to better understand any individual tax system, but also the range of policy alternatives that are available. And in fact, one may say that global tax analysis can also be particularly useful, since tax law is constantly changing and is almost by definition cross-country dependent. So whatever tax arrangement one country will adopt, at the end of the day will generally impact those arrangements of other countries. So it is commonly understood that over the past 30 years, the world has become increasingly more globalized. And globalization generally refers to the increased integration and liberalization of markets all around the world. This in turn makes capital, profit, and to a lesser extent other components of the tax base, that is, other economic activities we generally want to tax, more economically mobile. They flow around the world more easily, less costly, and to a greater extent. Accordingly, there have been increased pressures on taxpayers, on firms, as well as on households, to really take advantage of this increased mobility and shift those bases to their most productive location. And we can see really the effect of this increased integration and liberalization of markets, as well as the increased mobility of economic activity by simply looking at the world trade, as well as on the increase of foreign direct investment, those cross-border investment that are being done or being pursued by corporations. So we know, for example, that the value of world trade, that is goods as well as services, as a percentage of world GDP increased from about 42.1% in 1980s to about 62.1% in 2007. When we look at foreign direct investment, then we can see that foreign direct investment increased from about 6.5% of world GDP in 1980s to about 31.8% in 2006. And our understanding is that these forces of increased integration and liberalization of market and this increased mobility of economic activity really pose significant implications for tax policy all around the world, as countries may feel that they are increasingly in a position to compete for these mobile tax bases. Tax competition is generally defined as a strategic, non-cooperative interaction between tax jurisdictions of different nations, with the objective to both attract and retain mobile tax bases. Many times that will refer to profits, capital, and income that are considered to be most mobile, generally in that order, but in some contexts it can also refer to labor as well as consumption. And our understanding is that if increased globalization in fact leads to tax competition, at least to some extent, this will increase the pressures for all countries to lower their tax rates and broaden their bases. And at the end of the day, it will compromise the ability of individual nations to tax mobile bases, introducing additional distortion throughout tax systems all around the world. And I'm going to address some of these distortions today. And indeed, if you look at the data that is provided by bodies such as the OECD, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Economic Forum, you can identify certain trends that seem to echo some of these concerns. For example, one of the most prominent tax trends since the 1980s has been a steady drop in top personal and more drastically corporate income tax rates. These trends of rate reduction have been accompanied by some base broadening, but the base broadening has been accompanied for the most part in the area of corporate taxation. For example, according to the OECD report for 2011, in the mid-1980s, many countries had top marginal personal income tax rate that were well in excess of 65%. Sometimes the top marginal income tax rate was even closer to 70%. And for 2011, the average personal income top rate is only 41.5%, which is significantly lower. Top statutory corporate income tax rate also declined drastically from about 45% in 1980s to an average that is lower than 26% at the OECD for 2011. And the data suggests that developing countries show similar trends that are also relevant for effective tax trend. So we will see those trends of rate reduction all across the board. So at the same time that we see this trend of rate reduction and base broadening with income taxation, at least to some extent, we also see an increased interest all around the world with expenditure type of taxation. At the end of the day, mostly we are talking about broad-based expenditure taxes, such as the value-added tax, the VAT, and the general sales tax, the GST, with more than 140 countries all around the world today adopting subtype of a VAT, and a VAT being responsible for generating or raising more than 20% of world revenue. In fact, since 1990, with the OECD countries, the share of the VAT as a percentage of GDP increased from about 5.3% to 6.5%, generally compensating for the loss of revenue with income taxation. So why do we see this increased popularity of the VAT? The popularity of the VAT and its increased popularity is generally attributed both to its administrative and enforcement ease as well as its efficiency attribute, which is mostly relevant for this discussion today. Expenditure have relatively clear geographic location. That is, we can actually identify when and where consumption was taking place and really target, in terms of taxation, tax those particular location of those taxpayer residing in the particular location. And this feature of identifiable geographic location really decreases the mobility of the tax base of an expenditure type of taxation as a tax base, especially when you compare it to the income tax alternative, where income, as was just explained, is much more mobile in some sense. So if we have decreased mobility of the tax base, we have also decreased potential for international tax avoidance, which is very important with increased forces of globalization. But what we will see a lot of time with comparative tax scholarship, that they actually caution against a heavy usage of expenditure type of taxes. And the argument that we will see in that regards is that a heavy usage of expenditure taxation, especially when it comes in exchange to a greater use of income taxation, may pose significant challenges for tax progressivity. And the argument is that in practice, many expenditure taxes have very flat rates that makes them less progressive than income tax alternative. So it's not that progressivity cannot be added into expenditure type of taxation. It can be. It can be added either directly, such as by taxing certain goods more lightly than others. It can be added indirectly, such as providing direct assistance to the poor, not necessarily through the tax system. But at the end of the day, there are really limits to the amount of redistribution that can be achieved in this manner, especially again when you compare this possibility with the income tax alternative, when we know that progressivity is simply embedded in the income tax rate structures. But more importantly than that, what we need to be cautious about is the fact that a greater use of expenditure type of taxation basically marks a shift in the tax base from taxing producers, mostly capital as well as high wealth individuals, to taxing consumers, that is a broader base of labor. So it seems to me fair to argue at this point that if countries wish to avoid a race to the bottom, at least to some extent, where their ability to tax corporations, high wealth individuals, and income from capital in general is eroded. And if countries value safeguarding their capacity to utilize the tax system to not only fund government services, but also meet other goals, including redistributing income and constraining corporate power, then countries face the need to further cooperation among themselves. And this can be done, so the literature argues, through harmonization, integration of tax structures, policy, or administration, and even strengthening tax administration on a local level, on a national level, can go a long way in order to protect the tax base. When we look only at promoting cooperation, then so far the International Tax Administration has been focusing, for the most part, on addressing harmful tax practices. That is, what do we do on international level where we have very, very aggressive taxpayers that take advantage of different arrangement of different countries. So addressing harmful tax practice as a focus for international administration has been more so, for the most part, than promoting cooperation per se among different tax authorities. So now, over the past few years, we actually started to see this focus turn around, with more interest and more attention coming towards promoting cooperation. But at the same time, we also see the efficiency advantage of tax harmonization and integration, and their merits more generally really being put into question, considering the cultural, social, and political diversity of different nations. And the understanding is that as long as nations are diverse in what they bring to the table and in their essence, we'll see this diversity really trickle down to different tax structures. And that should be embraced and accepted rather than leveled. So what I want to look at with this project as I move forward is really whether the pressures of globalization lead to heightened conversion or actually diversion of tax structures all around the world. And this can either intentionally by, for example, international cooperation. It can also be unintentionally, such as simply letting the market do its own, work on its own terms. And an associate question is whether these trends, either conversion or diversion of tax structures, are actually a step in the right direction. So on one hand, we can say that with globalization come substantial forces of convergence, right? Given the cross-country effect of globalization, as cooperative strategies prove beneficial and market open towards one another, then conversion is simply natural to occur. And the worldwide rise of the VAT and GST over the last half a century really illustrate this point, right? So the remarkable similarity of a tax system all around the world, different countries all adopting the same tax structure all around the same time, amidst very different political, cultural, and social platform. Those countries at the end of the day are very, very different, yet all are moving towards the same direction. But what I want to highlight is that at the same time we see this trend of conversion with VAT and GST, with the VAT and GST, the exact specifics of the tax structure that were adopted, the VAT and GST, are really different across different countries. For example, when you look at the adoption of the VAT with the OECD countries, in 1966, only 2 OECD countries adopted the VAT. Today, more than 140 countries all around the world implement the VAT, and the United States is actually the only country, the only OECD countries to withhold its implementation. But the relative importance of the VAT as a revenue raiser mechanism varies significantly across countries, from raising just a little bit less than 3% of GDP in countries such as Japan and Canada, to raising more than 10% of GDP in Denmark, for example. Also, when you look at the rate of the VAT that has been adopted, then across the OECD countries, it's remained fairly stable, the average rate. From 1990, the average rate was about 16.7%. Today, it's just a little bit over 18%. But the actual standard rate of the VAT really varies significantly, from 5% in Canada and Japan to 25% in Denmark, Hungary, Norway, and Sweden to 25.5% in Iceland. So it seems fair to state, as some scholars have argued, and Professor Aviona is one of them, that notwithstanding that all-inclusive forces of convergence that come with globalization, conversion is still considered to be a relatively narrow phenomena that is limited to certain aspects of the tax code, specifically the corporate and international provisions. And in these areas, conversion may actually be a positive trend to the extent that it helps mitigate incidences and scope of tax arbitrage, where taxpayers take advantage of differences in different tax systems in order either to reduce or eliminate their tax liability. But what I want to interject just before concluding this presentation is that not only we can see with increased globalization forces of conversion or diversion, but actually we can see these forces taking place or at play exactly at the same time, either pulling countries towards one another or away from each other. For example, we have the work of a law professor, Jin-Yan Lee, who is a law professor in Osgood in Canada, and she looked at the anti-avoidance rules that were adopted in Canada in the 1980s and then just a few years ago in China. And Professor Lee concluded that although the general anti-avoidance rules appear similar on paper, they differ in several fundamental respects, including the challenges addressed, the motivation behind their enactment, their application and effects. Lee concludes that because the compared jars affect their tax system from almost opposite direction, they actually bring the two systems together. So we have the Canadian system where for many, many years, tax avoidance strategies were acceptable. That was okay for taxpayers to engage in. So the government had to implement the anti-avoidance rules in order to signal to taxpayers, hey, this is too much, this is not allowed. And we have the Chinese system, where tax avoidance strategies were considered unacceptable for many years, just as tax evasion. And with increased globalization and increased trade, the Chinese decided to adopt these anti-avoidance rules actually to signal to taxpayers, hey, this is okay. This is something that you can engage in. So we have two very different countries, two very different cultures, the same rules, implicate the system in very, very different ways, but actually bring them together exactly because of that. So to conclude this presentation, what I think is important in order, if we want to continue to investigate the area of globalization and how it impacts, how globalization impacts and shapes tax policies all around the world, including the trends of taxation, then it's not only that we should ask ourselves what forces are on the surface suggested by the data and the bottom line, but actually what forces are at play behind the scenes, either conversion or diversion, especially when they at play at the same time. In what areas or provision of taxation we can see those forces, sometimes to what extent and for how long. Thank you.